Hello and welcome to the second panel session on day 3 of Intelligent Transport's Transport Innovation Summit 2021. My name is Leah Hockley. I'm the Deputy Editor of Intelligent Transport and I'll be supporting this session today. Joining me is Ben Gilligan from East Yorkshire, Mallory Avis from Battle Creek Transit, Andrew Highfield from Hertfordshire County Council, and Kevin Orr from Liftango, who are here to discuss how technology can shape the future of demand-responsive and on-demand transport, but must do so without alienating public transport's core customer base. The role of moderator for this session will be placed in the capable hands of one of Intelligent Transport's advisory board members, Carol Schweiger. Don't forget that Ben, Mallory, Andrew, and Kevin will all be answering your questions at the end of the discussion today. So make sure to use the live discussion button at the bottom right hand of your screen to submit your questions, and the speakers will do their best to get through them. So I would now like to hand over to Carol as the moderator of our session today.
Thank you so much, Leah. And welcome everybody to webinar session 9, technology-enabled what I call mobility on demand that doesn't leave passengers behind. This is a topic that we've been discussing quite a bit, particularly with the very recent focus on accessibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think we've been having a lot of discussions about how these technology-enabled services can leave some of our population behind if they don't have the technology, they don't feel comfortable using the technology, or for some other reason. So we've been having a lot of these discussions lately, and I'm really excited to have our great panel of speakers today sort of talk to us about their perspective on this topic. And so what we're going to do to start the session is I'll have each of our speakers give about a 5-minute introduction to their perspective on the topic, and then we'll launch into a panel session. And as Leah said, as you think of questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll get to them a little bit later. So I think to start off, Kevin, why don't you go ahead and give us your perspective on this topic?
Brilliant. Many thanks, Carol. I'll start off by doing a very brief intro to myself. So I'm Kevin Orr. I'm the CEO of Liftango. We provide various shared mobility solutions around the world these days. Most notably our DDRT technology solutions for public transport, community transport, and in the corporate transport spaces. We began in Australia back in 2016, where the state transit body, Transport for New South Wales, had recently legalized Uber, one of the first to do so globally. And they launched 10 trials in Sydney and 10 trials in rural areas to understand if similar technologies could be applied to the bus industry. Would they be valuable to the taxpayer? And most importantly, where they would work. So we were part of those very, very early trials to understand that. Those learnings from the trials have helped Transport for New South Wales, I guess, validate that DDRT in many areas, but not all areas, is beneficial for the taxpayer. And they've actually ensured that DDRT is part of the future bus procurement processes where fixed route and DDRT are procured together in what are typically 9-year plus contracts. So very fortunate to have been involved in those early trials to, I guess, launch and learn and then take the technology to the other regions we now operate in, which is just some examples are Auckland with Auckland Transport. It's AT Local, it's called, running public transport DDRT with electric vehicles and also mass integrations there as well. We work in Battle Creek, the city of Battle Creek, Mallory here on the panel, which is a DDRT service for public transport across the region. Also in Portland in the USA with Nike, who have a corporate solution there. and with Go Ahead and North Lincolnshire Council in the UK, which is the largest DDRT service in a very, very rural part of the country, which I'll not steal Ben's thunder. I'm sure he's going to talk about the challenges that does bring. But ultimately, DDRT is this hugely exciting area that we see enables greater access to public transport, helps people that previously struggled to access, I guess, a public form of transport to get connected into their communities. And then from there, they can access even more mass transit options. So really is that, it's not necessarily first mile, last mile, it's a little bit larger, but it definitely helps to provide that access into more options. Hugely sustainable drivers, but also hugely equitable drivers as well, which is really exciting. And I still consider it this new field. It's continually evolving. It's very challenging to keep up with things. We've got EVs on the horizon in the minibuses. We've got mass integrations to cater for. And ultimately, our team sees huge variabilities across, I guess, the regions that we launch in. So you're taking in different behaviors of passengers and citizens across different geographies, across different densities, urban and rural. But ultimately, people just behave differently per the region they're based in. So different trends. So lots of things that we have to cater for and launch and learn on. But DDRT provides that data to basically understand what is the most optimal solution for it. So we do work with our partners to get to the deeper understanding for the local communities and the passengers, and then evolve from there. So I'll pass over to the next speaker. I don't want to take up too much time, but I look forward to the panel discussion shortly.
Thank you so much, Kevin. You touched on a couple of things that I think we'll be talking a little bit more about during this hour. So the challenge with different geographies, I think, is very, very important and something we can't leave behind. Also, sustainable services that are equitable and accessible. That's a big package of things that we need to be concerned about. We've always been concerned about the sustainability of demand response or paratransit. But I think now that we're moving into this more technology-enabled services, we still need to look at the sustainability. And of course, mobility as a service, and what does that look like together? It's one way of accessing mobility on demand. But anyway, thank you for your introductory comments. Mallory, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon to our guests. Good morning to my North American guests. My name is Mallory Avis. I'm the public transit director for the city of Battle Creek. We're in Battle Creek, Michigan. We are considered a small urban system, which means that our size kind of gives us all the challenges of an urban system and a rural system combined. So we kind of explored our possibility of on-demand transportation in this mixed area with a pilot from the state of Michigan. So we applied for some grant funding to be able to launch the region's first on-demand pilot. And we did that with our technology partner, Liftango. We were able to increase our service area from just over 70 square miles to just over 700 square miles. And really, this allowed us the opportunity to gauge what demand there was from the public, how we could meet that demand, whether or not this was a sustainable model versus traditional demand response dial-a-ride style transportation. And then really our goal was to demonstrate coordinated transportation with our other community transportation providers and to change the perspective of public transportation. So in 2019, the city's only cab company closed, and that really launched us to start thinking creatively. A city our size doesn't have Uber, Lyft, or other TNCs. So really the buck kind of stopped at public transportation, and the community looked at us for a solution. So we brainstormed, we got that information on a Tuesday, and we brainstormed and launched our first iteration of BC Go that Saturday. 100% call center based, a fare structure that ended up changing. And we learned a lot from BC Go 1.0. But the biggest thing we learned was that there was a demand for the service. Throughout this pilot, we're just over 8 months into the pilot, and throughout this pilot, we have continuously learned what it is the community is asking for, and how often people assume that this is not public transportation. So for us, it was important to distinguish this separately from paratransit. It's a separate brand, but it operates very much the same, and it's often commingled. So we use black vehicles. Our driver gets out and opens the door. We wanted it to feel like a premium service that doesn't necessarily carry the stigmas that public transportation carries. And it's a vehicle, a traditional minivan that is accessible so that anybody doesn't mind that vehicle pulling into their driveway, and nobody feels like there's a stigma attached to using public transportation. Our reception from the community has far exceeded what we thought it would. We thought we could run this pilot with 2 vehicles, and we're only at a 25% matched ride rate. So for example, we have over 20,000 ride requests, and we've only been able to fulfill about 25% of those. So I am looking forward to the opportunity to discuss more about this and our experiences. We are very much conscious of making sure we are not leaving our passengers behind, and whether that's our rural passengers or our urban passengers, this is a great topic to discuss. Thank you, Carol.
Thanks so much, Mallory. So several things again that I think we ought to talk about. One is going from a service area of 70 square miles to 700 is significant. And I think a couple of other things that you mentioned that are really key. One is changing the perception of what public transit is. You know, it's not a big 40-foot bus riding around empty with all kinds of stigma attached. And that's really fantastic that you've been able to change that perception. And I think the other key thing, and Kevin mentioned it as well, is commingling of services. And that brings several challenges with it. We know that, but I think commingling some of those services does raise sort of the perception of transit. And it may take a while for agencies to do that, but I think that's an interesting approach that we can talk a little bit more about. So next, Ben, if you can give us your perspective on the topic, that would be great.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're on the other side of the world. So my name is Ben Gilligan. I'm director of a company called East Yorkshire Buses, who are part of the Go Ahead Group. We're a UK-based transport PLC, although with operations across the world. Our business is based in Yorkshire, in England. And I've come to this with sort of perspective of having spent nearly 18 months now operating an on-demand service, that we've certainly learned a lot in that time. So to give a bit of background, this service was put out for tender by North Lincolnshire Council, who are a local authority just south of the River Humber in the UK, and they had an existing on-demand service that was probably a traditional, what we call dial-a-ride service in the UK, where people would phone up, get booked onto a bus and get taken where they needed to go. And North Lincolnshire's vision was to develop a transformative demand responsive service, but still provide the facility for people who weren't so technology savvy to be able to book on the phone. So we went out to look for a technology partner to deliver this. We settled on Liftango, having sort of done a bit of a trawl of the market, because we felt that the product that they offered most met the requirements of our customer in terms of being able to book 28 days ahead, which is what our service is probably more focused on, rather than being able to book within an hour or two of traveling. So it was something that the local authority were very keen to deliver. We put the bid in just before Christmas 2019, and it was awarded to us in February 2020. Now, clearly, in terms of timing, that brought about some challenges for us because it had originally been envisaged that this service would start in April 2020, which very quickly became unviable. Initially, the launch date was put back to July 2020 and then subsequently September 2020. So the service itself, we deliver it using 6 Mercedes-Benz minibuses that are 15-seaters. Every bus has a tablet on it, as you'd expect with these services, and we employ 9 drivers on it. Just to put a bit of context in the area that we're serving, so North Lincolnshire is, as I noted earlier, it's a very rural county with a lot of the population centred in Scunthorpe on the south end of the area. Scunthorpe is a steel town, very heavily focused on heavy industry, but a lot of the rest of the population, it's small villages, it's very sparsely populated. And as part of the council's ambition, they wanted us to be able to deliver this on-demand service that would ultimately replace tendered bus services, which in the UK generally have filled the gap where services that are no longer commercially viable for bus operators to operate, generally they're provided and funded for by the local authority. Since we launched in September 2020, we've carried 24,000 passengers, which interestingly enough, the actual booking match rate is very similar to the experiences that Mallory's had at about 25%. So there's some clearly similarities, even though we're on the other end of the world. We've got about 3,500 active users, and I think the stats are pretty good, given that in the UK we've had 2 lockdowns during this, and we launched in the middle of a pandemic. So some of the key challenges that we face: it is a rural area, and that means journeys are long, and it's a big challenge to get the level of ride sharing up. We're at about an average of 1.1 people per trip. We have carried as many as 10 people on trips before. Some trips are regularly carry 6, but we do need to be able to drive that up to be able to get the efficiency there. People are generally on the bus for longer than they might be on other similar schemes because of the mileage as people travel. And that is sort of the key challenge that we are working to overcome at the moment, because we're very keen to be able to use the service to feed into other services, so people are on the bus for shorter periods, and it thus frees up more time for additional bookings. The other challenge is, or the other final challenge here, is that we have to be able to avoid abstracting from the commercial bus network. And what we can't do as part of this service is pick people up in the Scunthorpe zone, because there is a commercial bus operator there. And bear in mind, for non-UK participants today, bus services are a commercial business in the UK, and we cannot abstract from their services. And that's one of the big challenges that we've worked to overcome quite successfully, I believe, over the last year and a half that we've been operating this service. So I look forward to participating in the panel today.
Thanks very much, Ben. That's a significant challenge, to not be able to operate service where there's already a commercial service available. But a couple of other things, again, picking up on the rural theme and the fact that people have to be on the vehicle a little bit longer because of the distances. I think those are all the things that we'll discuss a little bit more as we go along. So thank you for your thoughts on that. And Andrew, last but absolutely not least, why don't you give us your perspectives on this topic?
Cheers. Thank you, Carol. Thanks for having me today. My name's Andrew Highfield, Head of the Integrated Transport Unit at Hertfordshire County Council. I think there's some quite clear synergies really with what Mallory and Ben have both discussed in terms of the setup of our on-demand service as well. So just give a bit of context. We set up a on-demand service called Herts Links in Hertfordshire 2 months ago now, which we launched. It was part of a successful bid to our central government here for the Rural Mobility Fund, which was offering grants to councils to set up new on-demand services. So we were successful with that. We launched a service in northeast Herts of the county, which is a large rural area connected to some key towns. General population of those rural areas around 36,000 people, but then obviously counting out up the number and thousands of people at the towns as well, which are the key hubs we link to. We also found during the analysis there's at least 10 villages of around 4,000 people who have had no public transport service at all within any easy reach. So we had a clear focus with this service on focusing on reducing social isolation, access to education, healthcare, leisure opportunities, and obviously also workplaces. So we set up Hearts Links, as I mentioned, 2 months ago. It's been really good since launch. I think there's probably five key learnings we've had probably since the launch and leading up to it, really. I think the first one was clarity about the analysis and why we'd chosen the area we had, which we put a lot of effort and work into to make sure the numbers and the ingredients added up, where there was a significant area with, like I mentioned, a lack of access to public transport, a lack of access to cars, where we knew there was going to be some form of demand for these services. That was also followed up by some really good local engagement with community groups, local councils and other businesses to make sure there would be the demand there from the different users we would be targeting. I think the second key learning we had was to be clear about our technology needs. And as has been mentioned, around phone line bookings versus app bookings. Also our vehicle specifications to make sure they were truly accessible vehicles for wheelchair users, and other things we needed to consider, as well as operating hours, and how the service should generally be set up and marketed, which is a key learning for us. I think the third thing, which again I know has been mentioned, around that foresight and future-proofing in terms of integration with other services such as Dial-A-Ride, paratransit, local businesses, and also some of our school transport, which is an active plan we're now working on going into year 2 of the pilot. I think the fourth thing is probably virtual bus stops, which I'm sure will be discussed. So we were really clear that we wanted to make sure they were reflective of, again, local demand and where we needed to put them. So we've got 295 virtual bus stops, some of which do mimic existing physical infrastructure that's out there. And the granularity of data we've been able to get from the service has enabled us to already put in 43 extra stops based on feedback from local users. And that leads me into my fifth point, really, which is the granularity of data. The availability of the data we've been able to get as a local authority compared sometimes to fixed routes is incredible. You know, we can see the feedback that each passenger gives to the service after they've made the journey. We can see how bookings are made. We can see where people are traveling to on A to B on a daily basis. So that's allowed us to do much more in terms of incremental changes than big bang changes that we might normally do with a fixed bus route. Yeah, that's all from me, Carol.
Excellent, Andrew. Yeah, I think your 5 points we'll further discuss here, all of them important. One of them that I think we'll come back to a little bit more is on the technology side. Again, like you said, you know, how many people are simply using their home phone, not using the app, making sure that people can still access the service if they're not using the app. And a couple of the other things, like you said, I want to explore that virtual bus stop topic a little bit more as well. But just to delve into things a little bit beyond our initial discussion already is just a couple of questions that I have for each of you. And Kevin, I'll start with you. So DDRT, as you mentioned, has been really there's been a rapid deployment of that in the last few years. You know, what do you think has contributed to that? Do you think it's, you know, the fact that a lot of legacy demand response systems, frankly, I always laugh when I say demand response, because frankly, they're usually not very responsive. You know, you have to call a day or a few days in advance. Is that one of the things that could have led to more of the mobility on demand? Or what other things have led to that in your mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's definitely a few things that have led to it, but to your point on the inconvenience, I guess, that comes from maybe having to book 24 hours in advance or earlier. There are a lot of Dial-A-Ride services, legacy, that have been around for many, many years, which people rely on daily. and they're a great form of transport for the people who know about them. I think that's what we find out quite a lot from clients and partners, is that they'd like to expand the service to get more people recognizing that there are these services out there for, I guess, filling in the gaps within existing public fixed route networks or train lines, etc. That causes some complication actually when you're taking a dial-a-ride service and essentially digitalizing it, because it goes from something that was maybe treated more like a personal taxi service. You call up ahead and you book for your 5 friends or something of that nature, to something that is trying to get more passengers, trying to do more ride sharing at the same time as traveling, catering for the travel for those 5 people. So there's a little bit of education when it comes into that. It's a public transport mode. It might deviate to pick up more people, but these things are, it's an evolution. It's a way that the council has to use to make it more economical to continue to offer that service. There's a little bit of education there. But absolutely, I guess connectivity, marketing, more visibility is a big part of that. The convenience level that technology provides is you can get down to a level of almost instant booking. That is less likely to happen on a DDRT, that instant booking. That is definitely more a Uber type service. If you need it right now, you've got greater chance of getting it if you use Uber. But if you have something in, say, an hour, 2 hours time, or you want to book for all your travel for the whole week and cater for all, or even 28 days in advance, it depends. You can do all that digitally. You don't need to call up and do all those things. So greater level of convenience at the booking stages. And then similarly, there's the communication levels that you get once you do that as well. So you're getting text messages and prompts, and you can see that your bookings are there. So you provide passengers, I guess, more comfort, meaning they're less anxious when it comes to actually traveling. The text messages are quite good for our elderly passengers, we find as well. So a lot of them do have mobile phones, but maybe don't have mobile phones that can cater for apps. So the text messages are something that is quite nice. They can still call up, book their trips, but they still get some level of communication that gives them, I guess, comfort and less anxiety of trips coming. So that's a big part of it. But I think what I mentioned in my kind of introduction is that what Uber did within the taxi industry, bringing in technology and providing all that value to passengers, is something that councils and cities, municipalities are seeing more and more. That was the driver for Transport for New South Wales, to get ahead of the curve and be part of the solution rather than be, I guess, disrupted, to use that term. And I think that's just slowly growing year on year. We've definitely moved away from a level of pilots and early understanding. There's still lots to learn, but the early understanding has, I guess, been achieved in most countries, most parts of the world. So we're seeing longer term contracts. We're seeing something that's more integrated into the public transport system that's already there, which has, again, meant that there's more continuity to these services. What we dislike and have seen in the past is when there's pilot projects that are launched, very successful, there isn't a continuation of funding to continue the services. And that disruption to the community is quite large. And we don't like to see that. So luckily, we're not seeing that as much. But the evidence, the one last thing actually I should say as well, sorry to steal the floor of it. I think the analysis up front that everyone does to make sure that DDRT is the right solution for the right areas is much higher than it ever used to be. And I think that's driven by ourselves and others, other sort of vendors, but also the councils are starting to realize that they do their homework first, understand it that little bit better. Yes, you can still launch piles to refine, but it's done off a basis of data insights. So we're seeing less projects launched in the wrong places as well.
Thanks for your thoughts on that. Andrew, you mentioned several of the things about the analysis part of it, which that was, your first key learning was sort of the depth of the analysis that you needed to do to understand what the needs were in the community and how you could serve those. So I think that's sort of a critical piece of things. One thing sort of on that theme, Andrew, is based on that sort of in-depth analysis that Kevin was just talking about, and you mentioned before, how did you set up your service to make sure that you really were meeting the needs of the community, recognizing that there are a lot of different needs out there for transport of this kind?
No, thank you. Really good question. I think the key part for us was to validate what looked great on paper with that analysis. And what we tried to do with that was work with local community transport groups who are already in this space in the area, as well as local councils and other parts of sort of local government, to really unearth and see what feedback we could get whilst we were planning the service, to test our analysis and what looked great when we were doing that analysis. I think the other key thing we did during the summer was we got out there and did a load of road shows. We got one of the vehicles wrapped and branded, and we got out to 7 key locations. Alice, the project manager for the service, and the team got out there, talked to people, handed out leaflets, flyers. So whilst we did a lot of new media and social media, we also followed that with traditional media, just to get out there and let people see the vehicles. And what was great from that, just for one example really, is we were at Buntingford Classic Car Show. Those not in the UK, it's a great classic car show if you're ever near Buntingford in August. But we went there with the vehicle. We talked to a number of residents who talked about how far away the local bus stops were from a retirement village, which had just been developed in the last couple of years. And what that enabled us to do is listen to the feedback, work with those residents. And like I mentioned, Alice, our project manager, is now putting in a virtual bus stop for that retirement village, which instantly reduces that walking distance to existing bus stops for HeartsLink service. We maybe would have got that from analysis, but maybe we wouldn't have. And I think it's those interactions which were so pivotal over the summer to give us the confidence that we sort of had the right service in the right area. I think the other thing it did from that engagement was gave us a load of stuff that we could feed into the design of the service. So for example, we made a decision to accept concessionary passes locally, which again is sort of the older and disabled free access to transport in the UK. And we claim the reimbursement after. So we made a conscious decision to accept that on the service, as well as our local Saver Card scheme, which offers half price travel for 11 to 25-year-olds. So it allowed us to tweak in terms of what sort of tickets we allowed on the service. The other thing it really did is we heard loud and clear that we did need to introduce a phone line for bookings, as well as the web portal and the app. And it allowed us to get that into the contract specifications for our provider who's running the service for us, to put that in place so that those who didn't quite feel comfortable with technology could do that. So I think not just the process of sort of engaging and not just doing it to be seen to be doing it was important, and to actually do that meaningful engagement and talk to residents gave us some great things we included in the service from the launch date, as well as allowing us, like I mentioned, to increase virtual bus stops and other things in terms of the service.
Thanks, Andrew. That kind of leads me to ask Mallory. So before you had BC Go, people were probably used to kind of, again, the old sort of paratransit demand response model. So what has the adoption of the technology that came with BC Go, what has the adoption of that technology been? Has that been a challenge to get people to use that and understand it? I'm kind of curious about that aspect of the service.
Thank you. So we were actually quite surprised. Our system prior to BC Go was, I'm going to say, archaic. We still have on our fixed route system paper tickets. We didn't have any kind of app or website or travel planning. We have no GTFS data, so people can't even use Google to plan their trips. So we were 100% call center based, and we had to have 4 dispatchers there to essentially answer questions from when can I book a ride to when is the bus going to be at the stop. And so we weren't sure what the adoption rate was going to be when we introduced an app. And we were aware that the majority of our users are going to continue to stay with their traditional level of service, or so we thought. And they were going to keep calling our call center. And so it was important that our call center was able to book rides for our traditional paratransit service and dial-a-ride service, as well as BC Go. However, 2/3 of our riders on BC Go are using the app, and 2/3 of our riders are paying with a credit card or debit card, or purchasing wallet funds to pay through the app as well. So that was our first foray into it. We had never been able to implement electronic fare payment in the past. So this has kind of demonstrated for us that our passengers are ready, and they're clamoring for it. And we have kind of to the point of, Kevin before, and we have riders who have downloaded the app, but they still call to book their ride. They use the app for notifications. It gives them a push notification, lets them know when their vehicle is on the way, and they like that feature. They just don't want to book their ride through the app. So we kind of have a Venn diagram of users for it, but we have been pleasantly surprised with our adoption of it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic story. Just going from absolutely no technology at all to something that people really are embracing. And I think that challenge is around the world, moving into these technology-enabled services. But the fact that you experienced that, particularly given the geography there that we talked about, you've got rural, you've got suburban, and you've got urban. So there's a lot of challenges there between areas, which sort of leads me to ask Ben a question specifically about that. In your situation, Ben, what do you see that are the differences between sort of a mobility on demand type of service that's operated in a rural area versus an urban area? I think, Mallory, you've proven that you can do that, but Ben, in your situation, what do you think the key differences are and the challenges there?
I mean, I think the key differences really come down to the length of journeys that people want to make, and that obviously has an impact on how efficiently you can use the vehicle. So when we were in the early stages of planning for this service, we went to look at the Oxford Pick Me Up service run by one of our sister companies within the Go Ahead group. And it's clear there, because the area operated was sort of suburban housing and businesses, a lot of the journeys were generally fairly short, point to point, quite a lot of ride sharing. The big difference we've seen with running the Just Go North Link service is that people are travelling further. They could sometimes be on the bus 30 or 40 minutes, which is a long time, given the available resource, and what that then does to make the bus effectively unavailable. So what we've been doing, working with the main customer, North Lincolnshire, and also with Liftango, is looking at how can we tweak the software to allow us to reduce the number of times that people can't get a bus at the times that they want it. So we've changed things like the booking window, which gives people more flexibility. We're working to develop further rollout of the technology that sits behind the app, that means that the vehicles will be effectively rescheduled more often, to kind of keep it in layman's terms. That will mean that we're constantly looking at, is that bus in the right place? Could the bookings be swapped between them? And I think it's also about communicating with the customers, because at the end of the day, a lot of the customers have either come from the traditional Call Connect Dial-a-Ride service, which offered a different level of service, or they have come from previously tendered fixed route buses, as they may be known, for us, sort of regular scheduled timetable services. And they need to understand that actually things might be different. You might have to be a bit more flexible. You might have to plan your booking ahead. And that's required a big change in people's culture, behaviours, but also communication from us, so that we can maximise how well those buses are used. We've recently changed things around where so obviously the drivers have to take a break during the day. We've got quite a lot of flexibility around that now, so that the vehicles can be directed to the place that's going to be closer to their next pickup. So again, you're reducing the waste and the inefficiency in the operation, and reducing the amount of dead running time, which is fairly critical. So it is a big difference. The distances are vast, maybe not compared to North America, but relative to, for the UK, some of the distances are long, the roads aren't always direct, and that does have a big impact. And clearly, it's in our interest to ensure that the maximum amount of time that those buses are out there, they're carrying passengers, so that we've got fewer disappointed customers because they can't get on at the times that they want to get on.
Thanks, Ben. That kind of leads me to something that each of you has said before while we've been discussing this, but given the challenge of the long distances, trying to get as many people as you can on a vehicle, let's talk for just a minute about sustainability, because this is something that we talked about again with traditional demand response or paratransit services. And we've all experienced that those services tend to be very, very expensive. There's a lot of subsidy. Well, at least in the US, there's a lot of subsidy of these paratransit, sort of traditional paratransit services. And now that we're moving into this more on-demand technology-enabled services, how do you view the sustainability? And that, I'll just open that up to the panel, because I think that's one of the things we're all asking ourselves while we're running pilots. That's fine. But as a few of you said, once that pilot is over, you hope that if it's successful, you're able to continue it. So how do you all look at sustainability? And I'll leave it open. Andrew, you want to tackle that first?
Yeah. I was just going to mention, really, we've been quite open. Obviously, we benefited from the grant that we received from central government, and to launch the service in the way we did would have been really, really difficult without that support, which we're really grateful for. I think how we see the sort of vision for demand responsive transport is, as we've discussed a little bit, in terms of that integration into existing services the council, the transit authority already provides, also to complement the subsidy we do put into the fixed route bus network, for example. And we haven't reached a point yet, because we've bought ourselves a bit of time where we've not switched off any fixed routes that we contract, but we need to do that analysis in the next year to look at the modal shift and where it's occurred and how those services are complementing each other. But I think realistically, I guess it's not, a one size fits all situation. I think there might be some demand responsive that is commercial in certain areas and with certain sort of ingredients. But I think realistically for us, we're looking at how it can be integrated into our, as you call, paratransit, dial-a-ride services, as well as all the school transport and adult care services transport we already provide. For me anyway, I think that's sort of a long-term future of how we can make sure it's integrated into our model.
Thank you. Mallory, did you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, so just to elaborate real quickly, I think Ben has said it a couple times, and we can echo that even in Michigan, that we saw our productivity, our per passenger productivity go down when we expanded our service area. So now that we are serving the rural areas, we've gone from 2.7 passengers to 1.4 passengers. And so it does, the whole concept was ride sharing and most efficiently using all of our assets. But just the landscape and the geography makes that challenging. And so we are traveling potentially, we're in the northwest corner of our county, so we are potentially traveling all the way 30 minutes to pick up a passenger and take them 5 miles. And so one of the key parts of our grant and our pilot project from the state of Michigan is for us to be able to demonstrate coordinated mobility. And that allows us to utilize space on other providers' vehicles. So it requires major operational agreements, making sure that all of our providers in the area are on the same page. not only with the types of vehicles that we're replacing our fleet with, but with the level of service, the fare structure, and the expectations for the passenger. And so that also means getting everybody into the same technology. So very, mass oriented, that we are all able to play together nice and understand that we're not in competition, but that we can work together. And that deadhead isn't good for anybody. So for example, one of our community partners here is a senior services agency, and they have already been providing service to the community countywide, and they've been serving the whole 700 square miles. However, they're only serving their clients traditionally. They're only serving their seniors. So if I can utilize the deadhead time that they're already traveling, then that makes us both more efficient. And so that's really what we've been working with our technology on, is allowing those other agencies to kind of hop on, hop off our platform to be able to utilize their service so that they don't have deadhead, and for us to be able to alleviate some of those denied trips.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. And Kevin, did you have some thoughts about that sustainability?
Absolutely. Just like to add to sort of Mallory's point there, where it's, I guess what we see wanting to happen, but less, I guess, use cases today, but we will see more in the future, is this commingling of services that are already out there that in the past, because they weren't that well potentially not technology enabled or mildly technology enabled, that they had very siloed use cases. So like Mallory mentioned, just serve these people, and I'll get a number of buses that does that nicely, but I won't leverage them elsewhere in the community for other pieces. I think that's where technology and our technology is doing these things. You're breaking down those silos of use cases. It gets complex because you start having more stakeholders, and you need to obviously cater for those core use cases and offer them out. So it's not an easy one, but there's definitely a way to break those barriers down. I think Andrew's probably got a great vision for this, where you're looking at all your assets all around the council region, and going, how can we use them more efficiently, and going through that, I guess, process of understanding how they work and seeing what they can evolve into. So that's one way I think the future will enable a greater sustainability of DDRT, because the assets are out there. Trips are getting delivered. They can just be a little bit more optimal, which will help economics. But ultimately, I can see some of the questions that a lot of I guess approaches initially are that DDRT can be the silver bullet and be fully commercial. I think in high dense areas, like Ben mentioned, absolutely you can get that. But in more rural areas, you're not going to get that. But what you're going to gain is greater access, more connectivity, people being able to leverage other modes of transport, which is quite hard to analyze. But it's kind of the cross trade-off. You can great ride sharing, great economics at the high density level, and it kind of crosses over into greater accessibility, less ride sharing, but greater sustainability and access because of more people being able to access.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to, which I don't think we'll have time to discuss, but that speaks to what new metrics we need. Because even though you've got a lower productivity, again, like you said, you've got higher access once you move into the rural areas. And that's just as important as productivity. But anyway, Ben, your thoughts about sustainability, and then we'll take a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think we're obviously on the receiving end of the funding as an operator, and we kind of do what the client asks in some ways. But I think it's probably slightly more nuanced than that, in that, we have been working quite closely with the local authority that we deal with to try and drive up the efficiency and give them better value for money. I think fundamentally, though, is what it comes back to is what are the priorities, and if the priorities are to sort of open up access and connectivity that didn't previously exist. So, for instance, some of the rural villages that were not served by fixed services, but now have access to on demand. Well, that is a great thing for society if you can open up that demand And also it makes journeys possible that might not be possible previously, might not have been possible previously because you had to connect, you had to change buses and so forth. So I think, again, it's not just about the total cost of operation, it's also about what are you getting for the money that you're spending.
Exactly. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, and given that we've got about 10 minutes left in this session, let's deal with a few of those. So I have a question here for Andrew. Have Hertz CC changed their policy to allow national concessionary passes to be used on DRT services?
So we when we were doing the planning for the service, we checked out, and I think I mentioned this earlier, around accepting concessionary passes. So we looked into the detail of what we could allow on a DRT, and we are accepting concessionary passes. So yeah, pretty much yes to that.
Great, thank you. Question here for Kevin. Does Liftango cater for a fixed route service with DRT diversions off core route as against pure demand-led services? So it sounds like the question is about flexibly routed services.
Yeah, we don't see too many of those use cases, but we do cater for it in the configuration. So having, I guess the easiest way is to think about two hubs that the vehicle will travel down, and then obviously it can deviate off that to pick up people. So that's within a refined region. So yes, we don't see too many cases for that though. We have other solutions. I mentioned Nike at the start. So we have other fixed route solutions where there's, I guess, a number of shared mobility options that were desired, starting at, I guess, carpooling to demand responsive e-taxis is what they have, Audi e-trons, to then fixed route services that were connecting in from local train stations and things. So our solutions cover all those. So you get, I guess, the user can see all the different options that they might be able to travel. And we also stop the Audi e-trons traveling along the fixed route services, so you don't get that sort of double up of services. So I don't think DDRT should be doing too much of what the fixed route elements do very well. So we just provide more of the visibility to the passenger of those services and kind of put DRT where it makes sense.
Yeah, obviously you don't want to duplicate services, but there's a line that you cross there between sort of the traditional sort of fixed route services. Here in the US, the typically, not everywhere, but typically the flexibly routed services are working off of a fixed route. But that's sort of when flexible services got started. And again, we're all talking about potentially commingling the services and making each of them as efficient as possible. So I think that's critical. There's questions sort of technology related, and I know I have my opinion about it, but someone asked, why have no DRT systems have caller ID to populate the booking screen, allowing bookings to be taken with just a few clicks rather than typing anything in? All the taxi systems seem to have this. Now, I know in the US, there are a lot of systems that I've worked for that do have caller ID and sort of start the booking process from that, knowing who that person is that's calling in. So I'll throw that open to the panel. Is that something that your systems do already?
I'll go very quickly. We've seen other services use things like that. I guess the feedback that we've got is that people do like to speak to somebody, especially, I guess, the older demographics that are, I guess, prevalent in the rural areas and more likely to use DDRT as well. So, I mean, it is a choice. I mean, there are options to use it, but it's typically we see people going towards the having somebody to chat to. There are things within the app, there's features in the app that self-learn existing behaviors and try and prompt the users on, do you want to do this again? That does save on duplication of having to put in your writing all the time. So we offer that. So yeah, we'd probably try and do it in different ways. That time save that Agassi is getting, they're getting it. But open the floor to everyone else.
Anybody else have thoughts about the caller ID? Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to just summarize a couple of things and maybe ask for final thoughts. I think we've talked about a lot of things. I think the key part of this whole topic is providing access to people who have not traditionally had access to services. And I think all of your examples sort of have proven that this type of service can be provided, but it does come with a fair amount of analysis is really needed to design the service, to be able to educate the public. I think, Mallory, you've got some fantastic examples of the uptake of a service like this. I know with a lot of my clients talking about putting mobility on demand services out there, again, is changing people's thinking about how they access, I have to call a day or two in advance to, well, I can actually call a few hours in advance and get a ride. So I think that's critical. That leads into the whole discussion we had about commingling services, that I think we're going to see a lot more of that moving forward. And some of the other learnings, I think, Andrew, that you were mentioning specifically about operating hours, the technology, again, that requires the detailed analysis that you're doing all the time to make sure that you're properly serving the needs of the community. So at this point, I want to thank you all tremendously for providing your insight into this topic. I know I could go on for another hour or two with all of you delving into this a little bit more, but I want to thank all of you for your input. And I'm going to turn it back to Leah for the last minute or two.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carol. Well, as she said, unfortunately, that is sadly all that we have time for today. But thank you so much to Ben, Mallory, Andrew, Kevin, and Carol for your time today. And thank you as well to our audience for submitting all of your interesting questions. Up next today is a case study presented by Cognify on what technology can do to minimise the impacts of incidents in the rail industry, which will be followed by our third panel discussion of the day, during which speakers from Citybike, Tier Mobility, DOT, Human Forest and Centre for London will join us to discuss the steps that city and transport authorities can take to roll out new mobility modes and encourage adoption among citizens to ease the burden of traffic on city streets. And we hope to see you there. Otherwise, thank you once again so much to our speakers and our moderators today, and goodbye for now.
Thanks, everybody.